Protests against police brutality and systemic racism are spreading beyond cities and mainly minority areas of the U.S. in the wake of George Floyd's death. From coast to coast, people in suburban and rural towns are organizing demonstrations to call for change. Many of these communities are made up primarily of white people. Some are even in areas that have voted for Republicans for years. As Caitlin Huey-Burns and Kate Smith report for CBSNews.com, there have been more than 700 protests in all 50 states. All are in the name of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless others. Caitlin is a CBSN political reporter. Kate is a CBS News reporter. Welcome to both of you, Caitlin and Kate. Kate, let me start with you. How are these protests in these smaller rural areas being organized?
Tanya, it's nice to be here. Unlike some of these protests that we've seen in large, metropolitan areas like New York or LA or even DC, these are really coming from an organic, grassroots level. So I was speaking to the city manager in Dedham, Massachusetts, a small, mostly white suburb of Boston. He was telling me he only found out about the protest when he was just checking his Facebook account on Friday evening for a protest that was happening the next day. And in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, similarly, a small old steel town in Pennsylvania, just a little bit outside of Philadelphia. I was talking to the city manager there. He told me that an organizer just called his office and asked, hey, we want to have a protest, but we don't really know what we need to do in order to do that. Are there any permits? And he told me he wasn't sure if they needed permits. So it really speaks to, and we heard many of these stories, and it really speaks to, how these towns are really strangers to civic engagement on this level. But it also speaks to just the breadth and the vast engagement that you're seeing for the Black Lives Matter movement right now in the United States. That it's not just limited to these mostly progressive liberal cities. It's really hit the entire population.
And so, Caitlin, I want to ask you about that because, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement has been around for nearly a decade now. It's nothing new. And police brutality against Black Americans for even longer than that, of course. So the people that you're speaking with in these communities, why are they telling you that they've decided now is the time to get out and protest?
Well, I think it's two things. It's one, the timeline, and two, the pandemic. I think people that we've talked to and people that have been watching this from a political angle note the timeline. You had Ahmaud Arbery, you had Breonna Taylor, you had the racism shown by Amy Cooper in Central Park, and of course George Floyd. This also comes against the backdrop of a pandemic that has disproportionately impacted Black Americans in terms of the economy and the economic fallout, in terms of access to health care. So you're seeing kind of all of that come to a head at this moment. And you've also had a public that has been in their homes, really kind of watching these events play out without any other kinds of distractions that may have occurred if life were kind of going on normally, if people were going to work and different activities. So people have really been seeing a lot of this and hearing a lot about it. And that's really encouraged people to come out. And I think it's really important, though, to note the backdrop of the pandemic. I think that is hovering over all of this, just given what we've seen, the impact. And as we're talking about these issues of social injustice, of racial injustice, that is really kind of coming to a head, and people can see that. And then also compounding that with seeing these actions on video hit people differently.
Right. And Kate, as you mentioned, some of these demonstrations are in towns that had never come out to protest before, but a handful are even in communities with a history of racism. So can you tell us about some of those areas? What have the protests been like in those communities, and have there been some, difficult confrontations in some of them?
Well, that's exactly right. And, what we found was that not only were these protests happening in the outskirts of liberal cities and towns, but they were also happening in rural areas, places in Texas that, had been home to the Ku Klux Klan at certain points in history. So again, just the idea from going from that to hosting a Black Lives Matter movement not only shows people's interest and the importance of what's going on right now, but how widely people feel passionate about this issue. And, despite all of the different backgrounds of these towns that are coming out and their citizens are protesting, it's important to note that they're all asking for the same thing. They're asking for an acknowledgement of so many of these systematic, ideas that have happened that impact the Black community and so many of the obstacles that they've faced. And they're also asking for very specific things. They're asking for police reform. And what's so important to note is that they have been very successful. And I think that's a large part of why this movement is continuing and why the momentum is, continuing now into the third week. So in New York, it is expected there's a lot of legislation that would help some of the police brutality that has happened here in New York City that has swiftly gone through the legislature in Minneapolis. They're calling for the police to be defunded. And again, so much of the momentum that's happened has created success in those areas, which is why, a lot of people believe that is continuing.
Caitlin, as these protests continue to spread to suburban and, even those rural areas, as we've been discussing, what kind of implications could that have on the 2020 election? And how is it shaping the strategies of Joe Biden and President Trump? I mean, aren't some of these protests occurring in solid Trump country?
That's right. They are in congressional districts that are traditionally Republican and in suburbs that we saw in the 2018 midterms switch over from Republican to Democratic. So that is something that political observers from both sides of the aisle are really looking at. The strategists that I talked to noticed the broad coalition that they are seeing in these protests. I talked to one strategist in Georgia who said that he was struck by the idea that there were more white people protesting than Black people in some of the suburbs and in Atlanta that he had seen. And that's really significant because we have seen this shift in the suburbs, something that we saw really develop in 2018 and something that Democrats really hope will continue on. So it presents some opportunities and some challenges for Democrats, some opportunities and lots of challenges for Republicans. I think what you're going to hear Republicans try to drive home is centering on this push by some to defund the police. Now, when they say defund the police, a lot of people mean reframing, redistributing police resources in budgets. But that is something that you'll see Republicans try to focus on as they try to target these suburban voters. And then Democrats say that this is kind of a building of a new coalition that they saw in 2018 and trying to cultivate members into the party that may not have thought about it before. But it also raises some challenges of making sure that these people that are coming out to protest stay engaged in the political process. And sometimes when you talk to activists and even these new volunteers that we saw become kind of overnight activists, they have voiced frustration about not seeing the changes at the federal level and some kind of angst that goes along with that. So that shows that there is potentially still more work to be done to kind of take this beyond the protests and demonstrations that we're seeing and turn it into something that can be structural and organized in November.
Considering we're seeing all of this the summer before a presidential election, like you said, it still remains to be seen how long the energy fueling these protests will continue. But it seems, at least at the moment, both campaigns will certainly have to contend with it for this cycle. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. And I was talking to a Republican strategist who said that this kind of reminded him of what he saw in the wake of the Parkland shooting, where you saw an issue really kind of pop in the suburbs. And so this is something that really both sides are looking at. And it's really significant, as Kate mentioned, that we are seeing these in places that you just would not have expected even months ago.
All right. Well, Caitlin Huey-Burns and Kate Smith, thanks to both of you for joining us.